Hey, listeners. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to just direct you towards the Facebook group for this podcast. The Facebook group is called Economics Detective. You can find it just by searching Economics Detective on Facebook. It's a closed group, so you have to request entry and answer a few questions, but it's not exclusive. So, if you answer the questions, it doesn't matter what your answers are. We're not screening you for only people with Nobel Prize in economics. Anyone can join. And that is the place where you can find discussions about each of the episodes. So I'd like to sort of cultivate that as a space for people to discuss what they hear and any additional questions they have. I'll chime in if there are any questions for me. So go to Economics Detective on Facebook and join the group. That's the group, not the page, although you're free to like the page as well. I'd also like to say a thank you to all my Patreon supporters. I haven't mentioned this in a while, but people do keep finding me on Patreon and generously supporting the show, and I really appreciate that. Really helps to offset the costs of making the show and just demonstrate that people are out there and listening and appreciating having this content delivered to them on a regular basis. It's really great just knowing you're out there and you're listening. So thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. And now on to the episode. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Mikayla Novak of RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Mikayla, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you very much, Garrett. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our topic for today is institutional cryptoeconomics, which I think is going to need some explaining. So it's crypto, which at this point in 2019, listeners probably are familiar with the blockchain and Bitcoin. It's been around a few years, but this is sort of a different application of blockchain. So how about let's not assume that let's assume listeners have heard of the blockchain, but give them a quick reminder of what it is in the context and what parts of it matter in the context of institutional cryptoeconomics.
Not a problem. So in a nutshell, blockchain is what is called a distributed ledger technology. So what that means is that it is a technology of ledgers, which in itself pertain to how we record, store, and validate various economic, social, political, other sort of facts on the ground. And one of the sort of the attributes of blockchain is its distributed nature. So essentially, records are not stored sort of in-house in a sort of centralized way, let's say in a sort of a single firm or a small set of firms or a single government agency or a small set thereof. But essentially, these records are stored right across a worldwide network of computers, replicated, updated in real time. So I guess the normative rationale for that is essentially safety in numbers. So that is the sort of the distributed sort of aspect of this technology. So what do we mean by institutional cryptoeconomics? Well, it's certainly a sort of a phrase that's not sort of readily sort of discernible. So probably need to sort of take one or two step backs. Essentially, blockchain can have two or three effects on an economy. First of all, blockchain could be seen as what we would describe as a general purpose technology. That is to say that because of the ubiquity of the need for ledgers in our sort of modern economy and society, technology such as blockchain can have numerous manifold applications right through the economy. Very much like, for example, the internet is another example of a general purpose technology, road infrastructure, and similar. So essentially, you have a platform in which you have sort of various purposes, and I think that sort of aspect of blockchain is affirmed by the fact that there are certainly many sort of firms in the economy, many other actors in the economy, sort of besides that, are investigating how to use this distributed ledger technology for their specific purpose. So that's one interpretation of blockchain as a general purpose technology. The second interpretation of blockchain is that it's a potential cost saver. So by doing away with the conventional way that we record and store and verify facts, that is through very hierarchical, centralized sort of firm silos or government agency silos, which are vulnerable to security hacks and errors and theft and the like, and all the costs that are involved. The potential for blockchain is that it can actually save economic costs, transaction costs more specifically, to the extent that it has inbuilt features which can sort of minimize the costs associated with hacking and theft and so on, and as a result of that, actually shave some of the costs associated with third-party intermediation in the economy. So that's the second interpretation. The third and final interpretation of blockchain is that it's actually, and as the name that we coin, institutional cryptoeconomics, suggests, is that in fact blockchain is an institutional technology which can reshape the way in which economic actors can coordinate and govern themselves. So the previous point I made about intermediation sort of lends itself to an institutional interpretation of what blockchain can bring. So, for example, to the extent that blockchain technology is widely diffused through the economy, people can basically switch between different forms of governance. They can switch their activities away from, these hierarchical third-party silos, the big banks, the big corporates, big government agencies, and actually undertake their own self-coordination, emergent self-coordination indeed, through blockchain, and to be able to use the protocols which are available through blockchain, which is the security features, the distribution features, the ability to use economic incentive to encourage the addition of trustful uses of data on blockchain. So you're quite right. It's not necessarily reducible to a merely 1 minute explanation, but I think there's something quite profound to thinking about blockchain as an institutional technology which can enable people to toggle their use between different institutional forms as they see fit.
Yeah. So I want to sort of boil that down to like a really simple explanation, which I think you can think of it like, if we set aside issues of trust, what blockchain is doing is the same thing that someone could do with a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. For instance, if I wanted to start my own currency, I could just have a spreadsheet, keep track of who has how many, Garrett coins or whatever, just on my computer.
Mm-hmm.
And just keep track of things like that without the blockchain. And the issue there would be trust that I, as the person controlling the spreadsheet, could put a bunch of extra money into my own account or take it out of other people's, or do things in arbitrary ways that someone might fear that I would do because I hadn't established that trust. Whereas if it's on the blockchain, everyone has a copy of the ledger, which again is just like a spreadsheet. And the only difference is that we can only change it in ways that fit with the rules, set forth in advance. For instance, the two people making a transaction can agree to it and then transfer Bitcoin from one person's account to another, changing the ledger, which then updates on everyone else's computer. So it's it's just doing exactly, some straightforward things, manipulating ledgers, i.e. spreadsheets, and it's doing it in a way that is transparent and everyone can see. And so that's my super quick explanation. So far, we've mostly seen this technology just used for cryptocurrencies, so setting up new monies like Ethereum and Bitcoin and all those. What your proposals are involves setting up other institutions on this framework. For instance, I read something you wrote arguing that government transfers and grants could be put on a set up in using blockchain technology. Do you want to talk about that proposal? Like, why is that something that blockchain could be particularly helpful with?
Yeah, I think you allude to a quite important fact that blockchain technology is greater than the sum of cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is merely the first onset application of blockchain, and it has its own sort of peculiar advantages and disadvantages. I think the idea of an institutional cryptoeconomics is that it invites us to consider the notion that a distributed ledger technology, given the sort of the overall overarching, all-encompassing need to use ledgers in our economy and society, can be used for a whole range of applications. And they can include including the sort of the federalism aspect, which I'll sort of delve into in a moment, can include issues such as using blockchain for better trade coordination, using blockchain to improve the transparency and efficiency of social services, of welfare services in the economy, using sort of blockchain to record and uphold and safeguard personal identity, voting records and like. So what economists and non-economists alike are increasingly and happily discovering for themselves is that indeed there are potentially numerous applications of this technology. In terms of the specific example that you invoked, this relates to a post on the Medium website that I put up late last year on a topic of so-called crypto public finance. And incidentally, I mean, it sort of the idea essentially emanated from meetings that staff at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub in Australia had with some Australian government ministers, because certainly blockchain is attracting greater political interest. And so we had a meeting with a range of sort of senior politicians in this country, in Australia, asking us about potentially feasible applications of blockchain technology to improve the efficiency of the public sector, which is a vitally important question, not only in my country, but no doubt yours and elsewhere. And so one of the ideas that emanated out of that sort of small set meeting was the notion that one of the perennial bugbears of public sector administration in my country, that is the management of intergovernmental transfer payments between levels of government could be amenable for inclusion on a blockchain platform that the governments themselves can create. And the idea behind that is that if we had, as you've rightly indicated previously, a platform in which records of facts are publicly verifiable to all and sundry. Information can be recorded and validated in real time, and there are rules embedded within the distributed ledger technology that confer agreement that the proposed facts, data that to be inserted on blockchain is actually accurate and valid, can be applied to this particular public sector setting. The history of Australian public finance and the public finance of many mature federations besides is that it's extremely difficult to manage intergovernmental transfer payments with efficiency and great effectiveness in favour of general taxpayer interests. One of the great problems with the conventional way that which we record and store data is that, as I've indicated before, much of this information is basically washing through centralized hierarchical silos, and because of principal agent problems that you get in terms of not only the internal management of such hierarchical entities, but in terms of the activities, or in our case, the data that they manage, there are many instances or many opportunities for people to either induce errors and mistakes into those records, in our cases of the amount of monies that should be transferred between jurisdictions, or even in the very, very worst of cases, to actually have a lack of common management and verification standards, which allow for the theft and the hacking of information and data which relate to the intergovernmental financial transfer flows. I mean, these are massive, massive problems. And of course, consistent with that, one of the great problems in terms of funneling, taxpayers' dollars through these centralized hierarchical organizations, that is, government agencies, is that we're not really ever quite sure that $1 from me, the taxpayer, ends up being that exact same $1 to the end beneficiary, let's say in relation to an intergovernmental grant payment to, let's say, an Indigenous Australian residing in a remote corner of Australia. You can't look through essentially those the operations of those large-scale government intermediaries to be able to check that the flow of funding has been guaranteed. So the potential, the hypothesized virtue of blockchain in this context is that by having an open, verifiable record operating in real time, that really can only really be amended by the governments themselves, but is potentially scrutinizable to everyone that at least uses a blockchain, would be able to induce greater efficiencies and efficacies in terms of funds management, to make sure, for example, that intended dollar from me goes to the intended beneficiary in a remote part of Australia. So crypto public finance, that is the application of blockchain technology to be able to securely and accurately record the flow of scarce taxpayers' funding, through quite a gigantic sort of system of organizational arrangements, could be expected to yield very substantial value. And also in terms of, finally, you briefly indicated the ability to entrench agreements through blockchain. Essentially, intergovernmental grants as they exist today could be reconstrued as a set of so-called smart contracts through the blockchain, which obviously are not only verifiable to a broader public, however defined, but are only sort of activated or enacted if particular policy outcomes are secured. And that resolves another and relatable sort of dilemma in Australian intergovernmental finance, and I'm sure it applies more generally, and that is to say, one can never be sure, using the sort of current settings of relying on third parties, that decent policy outcomes, economically or socially, are actually being guaranteed.
Yeah, I guess what's really appealing about this is that there are already many efforts to make, government transfers and spending and, government finances more public and accountable. And, many countries have some version of a, public records law whereby, a citizen can request access to information that is ostensibly public, but these systems don't work really smoothly. There's information that in theory is public, but you could request it, and then the people who have the information could lose it or drag their feet for a year before releasing it to you. So it seems like this technology of if you were to set things up in a way that things are public knowledge, in real time using blockchain, which is I think what I want to emphasize about blockchain is that it is not as complicated as one might think. It is just a public ledger. I mean, the whole point of people doing accounting at all is for some form of public, if they come under scrutiny, then they have a record of everything that happened.
Yes,
or
that's right.
every transaction they made. And so doing it on the blockchain is just preemptively making it public before you come under scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a technological way of doing that. So it's an appealing idea. I don't think it's going to be adopted in the short run, but we are seeing smaller implementations of this kind of thing, like startups operating on the blockchain in some way or another. Do you have a do you want to respond to anything I just said first?
Oh, look, certainly. I think the way in which the public sector governments engage with blockchain is quite illuminating. So, in the sort of institutional cryptoeconomics literature, and I'll sort of cite the name of Trent McDonald here, who was an RMIT scholar who coined the term. Governments could potentially see the use and adoption of blockchain technology as a form of so-called crypto secession, away from conventional incumbent modes of organization, which is sort of centered around the recording and the validation of data. So to some extent, some governments can actually see sort of blockchain as a threat, and at the very extreme case, we observe so-called crypto unfriendly policies being implemented in jurisdictions such as China, for example, and some other countries in the Middle East and throughout Asia, for example, which have basically banned so-called initial coin offerings of cryptocurrency, have shut down so-called crypto exchanges to prevent people from buying and selling cryptocurrencies and whatnot. But we also see, on the other hand, and in contrast, a so-called crypto-friendly disposition being explored, as you quite rightly suggested, relatively small, modest, tiny footstep scale by a number of countries, particularly in, and but not exclusively, in the developed world. My country, Australia, yours, United States, other places such as Switzerland, Estonia, Singapore, and others have been quite proactive, relatively speaking, in terms of promoting trials of blockchain to their own public sectors, perhaps including the notion of sort of crypto public finance. So, but you're quite right in saying, and I think it accords with our observations, that the public sector adoption of blockchain will occur in a firmly gradualist manner, which is probably consistent with the much observed inertia that one can observe in terms of the elicitation of a policy cycle, from commencement to fruition of a new position. In terms of, if I can just turn briefly to a sort of second sort of generic point, just in response to your comments, Garrett, I think the crypto public finance is also interesting when you sort of compare the potentialities and the potential of that policy against what we already have. As you've astutely noted, in mature federations such as the United States, Australia, Germany, Canada, and so on, there are numerous bodies, governmental agencies, even some non-governmental entities, which are almost solely established to monitor and scrutinize and audit the performance of intergovernmental transfers. So what we have here is a term that I've coined called intermediary stacking, where in a world of sort of large third-party organizations which take on themselves the authority of recording and storing and validating data, the typical response to problems such as sort of hacking data, fraudulence with respect to data, theft, and other sort of security problems is to not sort of fundamentally address the structural problems of centralized management of data at its core, but to engage in an intermediary stacking where the solution always seems to be, well, if we've got a problem in our sort of public sector operations, what we need is a new body, to be able to address the problems that arise. So what you basically see, and this is very highly observable right across the world, is growth in the relative size and scale of government as reflected in the accumulation of more and more and more and more bodies in entities in relation to specific problems that are often raised by the fact that people do have this is standard public choice descriptor that people in public sector walks of life as well as in the private sector may tend to exhibit along some margins the exercise of self-interest, and that manifests itself in an opportunism, which then leads to a corrupting of data. So the crypto public choice idea, probably has some much broader implications in terms of how the public sector as we know it today presently organizes itself. At a sort of most optimistic or hopeful level, something like the adoption of blockchain technology in the public sector might just on various margins do away with the rationale for this intermediary stacking within government, because you basically have a low-cost sort of distributed ledger system, which basically substitutes for a lot of the administrative monitoring and surveillance functions that are presently undertaken by many human bodies working within government. So some very interesting implications arise.
Yeah, that's really appealing. So instead of having a bureaucracy layered on top of another bureaucracy in order to in order that one can monitor the other, you make everything very public and transparent so that anyone with an internet connection could, in principle, audit a government body and see if they're spending money in an appropriate way. And the cost savings to that are obvious because we spend a lot on monitoring, and a lot of real resources go into monitoring, and then you get this problem of how do you create incentives for people not to misuse money, and how do you create incentives for the people monitoring other people to 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 do the right thing. Transparency kind of brushes that aside and makes it just very clear why people should not misuse funds, and just because there's the constant possibility of oversight by the public, which is nice. I'm
Yeah, look,
reminded of yeah. Oh, sorry. Do you ever go on?
no. No. I think that's quite correct. Sorry, Garrett. And I think the issue out of here is that people always sort of tout blockchain as being an institutional mechanism which will invoke so-called trustlessness amongst the public, and I think that's a bit of a misnomer. And the fact that real flesh and blood human beings, especially non-intimates, certainly do require still the intricate sort of web of sort of trust in order to sort of fulfill and undertake productive ventures. I think along certain margins, the availability of sort of secure code that blockchain allows will be able to sort of substitute for some of those sort of administrative, highly codified manifestations of enforced trust, shall we put it? But it won't completely substitute for the perennial need the human beings have held since antiquity to be able to sort of trust each other. So, blockchain doesn't destroy society. It actually and doesn't destroy economies either. It actually sort of, hopefully, from the optimist view, sort of magnifies the advantages of large scale coordination that we already sort of find in the Great Society.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a Robin Hanson tweet where he pointed out that in a society where nobody does accounting and no one keeps track of their transactions, if you asked, if you suggested, hey, why don't we track all our transactions, and do accounting books, you'd be signaling to, the people working for you that you don't trust them, and it would be very kind of demoralizing. It's like, what? Well, why are you doing this to me? Do you think I'm going to cheat? And similarly, in a society where everyone does accounting, if a particular manager said, "Hey, we're all friends here. Let's just not keep track of our finances," that guy would be signaling that he wants to cheat. And so I think, going from accounting with with private ledgers and accounting that is off the blockchain, on a private server, and can be revealed to other people, when appropriate. If you move from that world to, if you suggest to an organization, hey, why don't you make your books public on the blockchain, you're kind of signaling a distrust in that organization. But in a world where everyone has moved to the blockchain, saying, hey, we're just going to do our accounts offline on Microsoft Excel, and we're not going to have them all be public. You'd be in a different equilibrium where, doing that would signal a lot of that you're up to something shady. So it's I guess it's this multiple equilibrium situation where it might be hard to switch to a world of blockchain. But if we were to do it, and more organizations started having their books be public, you can imagine moving to a world where every organization has to keep their accounts in this very public and transparent way, or else people suspect they're up to no good.
Yeah, that's that is a very interesting observation in the sort of broader context of our observations as to how large-scale intermediaries, the banks, the financial sector firms outside of the financial sector actually trialing the use of blockchain. Many of these entities are actually experimenting with the use of blockchain, not using public blockchains such as, for example, Bitcoin and the Ethereum sort of platform. They're sort of public and open sort of blockchain platform mechanisms, but instead a lot of these sort of larger firms in particular are using sort of private and closed blockchains. And I guess if one might hypothesize that one of the reasons that a lot of these sort of entities, which you may be incidentally sort of threatened on several margins by the mass introduction of blockchain, are actually going down this path, is that they wish to experiment and play with and tinker with the various dimensions of distributed ledger technology in-house. There's something to be said about the need for sort of productive play and experimentation in economies, to be sure. But certainly the hope is that there will be some point in which organized economic actors move away from one of the multiple equilibria positions that you've alluded to, and embrace open, publicly verifiable blockchain, because we would posit that there are just so many advantages for society and the economy as a whole by using an open blockchain where activities are publicly scrutinizable using the cryptographic and the game theoretic techniques embedded within such technology, as opposed to, essentially maintaining trumped up in-house spreadsheets, which private blockchains will be. So the real test of adoption of this technology is that if a sufficiently minimal set of economic actors leapfrog one of the thresholds of the multiple equilibria and encourage themselves to operate on public blockchains. So that will be the test, and how that evolutionary process will unfold. Well, certainly nobody can predict with any certainty, but certainly we would hypothesize that the extent of the use of private blockchains probably reflects the fact that right now in the world we're still very much in experimental phase, with blockchain trying to comprehend the full array of applications of the technology and trying to learn about the feasibility of being able to use this publicly sometime in the future.
Is there a how do you identify? I think a lot of people, blockchain is this sort of exciting technology. To a lot of people, it's just a buzzword they hear a lot, and it seems like there are proposals for blockchain to do, everything under the sun. Is there a sort of systematic way that you can say to identify when a problem is going to be is going to be able to be solved by introducing blockchain to it, and when it's not? What kind of situation would you look for like a place where there's a high return on switching to blockchain?
Well, I think you've actually got it in one with your sort of final sort of remarks within that question. It's not possible, I think, for an external observer to objectively declare at in which circumstance and under what conditions should an individual or groups of individuals find that the use of blockchain will be efficacious to them. So in their subjective assessment, and subjectivism is a very important concept within economics, within its core, subjectively people will need to make their own deliberations with regard to whether the adoption of a blockchain technology will yield to them net benefits, that is gains over some sort of notion of cost associated with switching away from their conventional modes of recording and storing facts. And the conventional modes of recording and storing and validating facts are, in some cases, centuries old. Sometimes we use paper to record our sort of facts, our transactional records, and so on and so forth. And more recently, with the advent of personal computers, we're using, as you've mentioned before, Excel spreadsheets, in-house proprietary spreadsheets as another way to record facts, and have databases and similar software tools as well for a given economic actor, whether they be an individual firm, government agency, NGO, or whatnot. The decision to adopt blockchain must involve a carefully mapped out mental and technical calculus with respect to the assessment and net benefit associated with switching from conventional non-distributed ledgers to, I guess, perhaps now at this point unconventional distributed ledgers such as blockchain. And to be very certain about it, Garrett, I mean, we do see anecdotally stories on a daily basis of entities within the economy, large and small, announcing plans to research and experiment in terms of the use of blockchain. Very interesting cases are coming out with respect to how blockchain might be used to manage supply chains. And that's quite an interesting sort of case example. There was a case example of some aquaculture companies recently using blockchain to record to track the flow of transit and all the financial and economic data attached to all of that of some yellowfin tuna, right, across borders. There have been similar examples of tracking coffee, the export of coffee around the world. So there's that, and so many other examples where surely the participants involved have made their own assessments that the potential net benefit of using blockchain is actually worth the risk of at least a trial, if not implementation itself.
Yeah, I think it's telling that the first real large-scale uses and the first adopters of this blockchain were cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin being used mostly to trade illicit substances. And that's a situation where people didn't have access to formal mechanisms for, contracts and dispute resolution and these things. They couldn't necessarily, if they used payments if you try to pay for illicit substances using PayPal or Visa or MasterCard, you can those transactions could be stopped, or they could be subject to scrutiny by people you don't want to be scrutinizing you. And so, like, in this particular area where all our standard mechanisms that that we use to establish trust and agreements and transactions were hampered by the fact that these were illegal markets. That's where blockchain first emerged as really a solution to problems people had in coordinating transactions. But what a lot of your work is showing is that in areas where, we do have global supply chains and they work fairly well, but what you're showing is that they could work a little better. They could lower their costs with this technology, as opposed to some of these illicit markets, which maybe wouldn't have existed without this technology. That's the really high margin sort of. That's why it was the early adopter. So so that's sort of an interesting case that is the first use of it, but hopefully not obviously not the last. We're seeing other ones too.
No, certainly, and I would certainly double down, if I would, Garrett, on the fascination with cryptocurrency as the first large scale mass adoption of an application of blockchain. It was extremely telling, and that person or persons known as Satoshi Nakamoto indicated very crystal clearly in their white paper announcing the parameters of Bitcoin, that one of the key motivations for the introduction of cryptocurrencies was a response to the monetary dysfunctions which had been brought to bear as a result of the 2007-08 global financial crisis. So in that sort of famous white paper, which is still very much readily accessible online for everyone to see, is that Nakamoto, posited a rationale for Bitcoin as essentially a challenge to the incumbent, probably now very well entrenched, obviously, system of central banking applied around the world. So the idea behind Bitcoin is that it's as much an touted as an anti-inflationary mechanism, if for nothing else, because of the fact that the technical protocols of Bitcoin only allow for the distribution of 21 million Bitcoins in existence ever. So as opposed to an infinite sort of supply of fiat conventional currencies, which, because by virtue of that infinite supply, reduces in its effective per unit value. So it is quite telling that the introduction of blockchain has sort of followed the path that it has, and it just got me thinking about a sort of process that Friedrich Hayek spoke about in his 1960 work Constitution and Liberty, in which he talks about diffusion of quite mundane sort of outputs in the economy, like cars and washing machines and televisions and irons and the like, from the wealthy to the middle class, and then down to those people with limited means, where he talks about a process of firmly a process of competition, which allows for the diffusion of such conveniences throughout the economy. So what the circumstances of product diffusion that sort of Hayek talks about was obviously underpinned by the legality of all such activity. Whereas, as you've quite astutely noted, the diffusion of cryptocurrencies and blockchain applications in general come from not from a sort of a positional standpoint of legality. That is, governments just have almost ex ante allowed for the diffusion of such technology, but they come from very much firmly a part of either a shadow economy or that part of society, a techno-libertarian sort of segment within society, which unremittingly sort of challenges the legality, if not the existence, of all of the sort of the organizational sort of structures imposed throughout society, all in the authoritative name of recording, storing, and validating data. So the history of cryptocurrencies in particular and blockchain more generally is interesting because we're essentially moving from basically a phase of mass disapproval of such uses because they come from a realm of illegality, however sort of defined, through slowly but surely into the realm of legality where sort of firms and government agencies themselves are actually tinkering and experimenting quite safely, quite legally with blockchain and its varied applications. So it's quite interesting to think about where blockchain has come from in its history.
Yeah, and it's interesting that one of the first spikes in the price of Bitcoin, one of the first times when it was really put on the map, when there was a currency crisis. I believe it was in Cyprus.
Correct. That's right.
When there was a currency crisis and the government, there was a sort of run on the country's money, and the government was imposing capital controls.
Yep.
And people, in order to save their life savings and all their investments they had in the country, they tried to convert into Bitcoin to sort of safeguard and to maybe not as like a permanent investment in Bitcoin, but just as a way of transferring funds out of the country. And that's and Bitcoin as originally sort of posed as a challenge to central banking. I don't think it fully succeeds.
No.
It's far too volatile to be to replace the US dollar, but
Agree.
But it is a good first effort, and there are many situations where a lack of trust in an institution can be a severe burden. For instance, currency crises, when governments in the developing world can't really be trusted people don't trust them to manage their currency, and that makes their currency even less stable than it would be.
Yes.
That's the kind of area where a blockchain solution could maybe help these institutions to establish trust. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think you touch on a quite important point in that, in the face of potential crypto secession, there is a capacity for public sector actors, for example, to learn and to respond. I think one of the sort of the downsides of particularly sort of the sort of Austrian view of economic thought is that there is a characterization of the public sector as a never-ending sort of bumbling sort of entity, sort of operated and maintained by an equally bumbling sort of set of individuals, sort of bureaucrats who can never get things right. Putting aside the fact that public sector actors as well as non-governmental sort of actors operate in very highly complex and shiftable environments, one would hope that the threat of crypto secession away from that stumbling, bumbling sort of realm of public sector activity onto blockchain might just encourage, in sort of game theoretic sense, encourage public sector actors to actually lift their game to ensure, for example, as you suggested, that there are stronger monetary institutions with respect to the maintenance of value of conventional fiat currencies. For example, some certain developing countries could instigate statutorily independent central banking with an announcement of more credible rules with respect to the supply of money. And that could be a legitimate response, a legitimate policy response to the notion that, well, if monetary rules of the game don't improve quickly, people can go transact on using Bitcoin or Ether and whatnot. Now, obviously, the extent to which that will be practically so is, as you've indicated, and we should be very honest about it, very practically compromised by the volatility of value in Bitcoin. And that partly reflects the fact that these cryptocurrencies now, are seen not as much as sort of currency substitutes to the state, but are actually seen as essentially assets, right, in their own right, like basically competitor assets to things like cash and houses and stocks and shares and whatnot. So that to some extent it forms its newfound volatilities. But certainly there's a prospect for public sector actors to learn, given their very real constraints, in response to the adoption of blockchain. And we at an anecdotal level at least, we actually see learning in terms of the gradual diffusion of specific blockchain relatable policies around the world, which slowly but surely adopt some of the best practices adopted by the likes of Switzerland and Australia and the United States and so on and so forth.
So we're running up on time here. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of general takeaways that someone listening to this conversation should take from it?
Look, I think institutional cryptoeconomics, without a shadow of a doubt, is both a fast and burgeoning subdiscipline within economics. The RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub in itself has not only sort of served as a sort of leading intellectual outpost for the economic consideration, the social scientific consideration of blockchain, but we see right around the world a significant growth in interest with respect to the very interesting and quite unique properties and implications of blockchain technology in terms of how it might potentially reshape society. Perhaps a good little anecdotal indicator of that is the number of blog posts, for example, on the Marginal Revolution website maintained by Tyler Cowen and colleagues, which refer to blockchain. So, just that little example in itself would suggest that blockchain is slowly and surely becoming mainstream. And I think that will have quite significant implications for how this technology will be diffused and adopted in reshaping our economic and social configurations.
My guest today has been Mikayla Novak. Mikayla, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Very great pleasure, Garrett. Thank you for having me.